Now, pages 20A and 20B represents a detailed list of various vendor programs that may want to be considered between the purchasing department within your maintenance management program and the vendor or vendors. First of all, item 1 identifies the equipment that you're purchasing. And here we need the input and the support by operations personnel, facilities engineering, and also maintenance management personnel. The equipment requirements is really a byproduct of, let's say, marketing and sales programs relative to the introduction of new products, new product lines, where additional equipment is to be obtained, where additional equipment is required. The sooner we can get some of that information into the equipment purchasing process, the better we have in terms of being able to select key suppliers that can provide the other things that we've talked about relative to the purchasing of new equipment and all of the other data-related elements that were at the beginning of this particular section. Secondly is the equipment spare parts, not only from the OEM of the equipment, but key, let's say, manufacturers of the spare parts. And this is really a continual program, never-ending, where we're always looking for the support of, let's say, new manufacturers relative to manufacturing spare parts, or based upon your own manufacturing capability, your own operations departments may also be considered in this particular area. Third is the equipment lubricants, and many lubrication suppliers can help you set up a lubrication system which would support the lubrication PM program, and this would be a good input into having, let's say, machine operators participate in the lubrication program. 4 indicates the type of cleaning that may be required relative to support your equipment and assets. And here again, this would be a good input for machine operators to participate in the development of various programs to enhance the maintenance management program. 5 would be different contract maintenance support. Now, common support would be tuck pointing, glazing, roofing, and let's say the care of lawn maintenance and shrubbery and any other activities that a contractor is a specialist in that area of maintenance activity. We also can look at the special tools that are used by maintenance personnel. Some of these tools may be expensive, and therefore you may want to consider a lease program with the ability to apply all of the lease costs to the purchase price of the tooling. Number 7 would be the special equipment used by maintenance personnel. And in this case, that could embrace predictive maintenance tooling, predictive maintenance equipment, and here again, you may want to first lease with the possibility of purchasing at a later date. Item number 8 would be the perishable tooling used by maintenance personnel, and these would basically be hand tools and other types of perishable tooling like sanders and grinders and saws, files and so forth, where it would pay us to review the availability of different suppliers, perishable tools on the marketplace, and to determine two things: the quality, the longevity, and then the cost of the item. Item number 9 are the diagnostic equipment. I've alluded to part of that in item number 7 and 6 above, but this is where we have unique, specific predictive maintenance applications. 10 would be vendor repair of equipment spare parts, such things as motors and gear reducers and transformers and other items where maybe it would be cheaper to use repair shops outside than it would be your own repair facility. And continuing on now in page 20B, we're looking at vendor barcode applications. One of the nice things about barcoding is to eliminate much of the transposition between your purchase order and the vendor data and your receiving against the vendor shipping documents. The next item, 12, would be the vendor spare parts stocking programs. Whether it's stored at the vendor or whether it's consigned in, you continually want to review the vendor stocking programs with current and new suppliers. There has been a big evolution in the supply industry relative to vendor stocking. More and more suppliers are moving toward the capability of storing material for you, whether it's internal or at their facility, to try and develop what we call single tier or vertical integration between the supply base and yourself. And 13 is the vendor packaging to support the two-bin or bench stock program. In many cases, you may currently be purchasing those types of items in some bulk form. And when we start to look at the smaller quantities that are used in the two-bin or the bench stock program, we would want to set up the packaging to be done by the supplier, and in many cases where it is a practical method of reusing, recycling the packaging material between the supplier and yourself. That certainly is going to reduce some of the supplier's expense in terms of supporting the smaller package quantity versus those larger lot sizes that are currently being packaged. Item 14 is the continual perusal of the shelf life program. There are more and more items that are entering the shelf life program. Many, let's say, self-lubricating bearings, many rubber products, and solvents and chemicals and paints and thinners and batteries are becoming more and more an integral part of the shelf life program. That is the responsibility, as I've said several times, to be supported initially by the purchasing department and then controlled by purchasing through the purchase order system. Where there are project or facility expansion programs, here is where purchasing can support those types of activities with either the operation personnel in your company, facilities engineering, and or maintenance supervision. And as item 16 indicates, any special environmental storage requirements to support not only the receipt but the subsequent storage and then issuance of those materials. And a great deal of input can be derived from some of the OSHA specifications, from EPA specifications and likewise from your own insurance carrier. Now, I've listed on pages 20A and 20B 16 of the major purchasing vendor programs that your purchasing personnel should consider. There are undoubtedly more, and as you think of more and more come on stream, they should be added to page number 20B, and the systems and procedures should likewise be developed for them. Now, the data that we have covered in section number 5 pertains to the data to enhance the purchasing activity to likewise support the maintenance management program. This is not a course in purchasing, but it is a course on the necessity to have full-time purchasing support in the maintenance management program. And I think we've been able to demonstrate the need for that support. Now what we want to do is to go into the next section, section number 6, and show how the purchasing activity is integrated with the storeroom or the crib program. Now, chapter 6 is going to discuss the maintenance storeroom, the warehouse, the tool crib, the tool room. It has many different names, and I'm not fostering any particular one. You'll notice that I talk about the warehouse, the storeroom, and basically the crib. Those are the three ways that I define this particular section. And pages 1 and 2 are some of the data elements that should be considered relative to setting up the warehouse or the storeroom. So I'd like to review these with you, and then if any of the items require further discussion and interpretation, I'll take the opportunity to discuss those points with you. Number 1, or A, is the spare part number, and B is the description, and C is the unit of measure. Now you'll notice that we show 3 different types of units of measure. The first one is the purchase unit of measure, and that's associated with the term receipt. And the second one is the storage unit of measure, and the third is the unit of measure for issuing. Between the receipt unit of measure and the storage unit of measure, as we've indicated previously, you will have to have conversion capability where that is a requirement. Now, item number D pertains to the steps relative to receiving material into the storeroom. The first thing we want to do is make sure that material which is received is what I call an authorized receipt. Now, there are several receipts that enter the storeroom. One would be the receipt against the purchase order. Second would be the receipt against the manufacturing order, if, as an example, you manufacture your own spare part. And then third would be receipts that could be from, let's say, other divisions. We call those inner plant receipts. And the last one would be the return of spare parts and tooling and equipment and maybe special documentation that were previously issued against work orders. The second step in a receiving activity is to identify material. And here we basically want to set up the disciplines of identifying material before it actually is put, let's say, into a storage bin location, or if it is for a planned maintenance work order, we want to identify it before it is actually placed in the area which is set aside for the planned maintenance work orders. The identification is done through various types of documents. They could be hang tags, they could be printed forms, they could likewise be barcoded and identified. And we'll discuss some of these identification issues a little later in this section. The third element is receiving inspection. And here again, we've identified some of the receiving inspection activities in section number 5 in the purchasing activity, because the purchasing activity, if you remember, has dotted line responsibility for the receiving function, at least against purchase orders, for both the accuracy of identification, the accuracy of count, and also the accuracy of the quality level. And the fourth step in the receiving activity is to count material. This is the first and only time that you're in a position to verify the accuracy of the material, not only as received, but when you put it bin on hand. And remember that bin on hand is reflected in the inventory management record for each and every item. And if you recall, our accuracy goal should be 100% accuracy at all times. Item E is the location control or locations. Items may be placed in more than one location, and we have a little procedure that we'll review with you in terms of location control. Item F are the disbursement adjustments. In other words, when we issue material, we want to make sure that all issues are accounted for and they are recorded not only on the storeroom record but also in the inventory record. And then where there is a need of, let's say, tool and equipment issuance, we have to set up the proper controls, the records, and the procedures relative to allocating tools and equipment to work orders. Item number H identifies the shelf life code, which we had talked about before, and that really is the responsibility of the purchasing function to not only institute the shelf life program, but to support it through the notation on the purchase order when an item is a shelf life coded item. The last item on page number 1 pertains to the cycle count program. We reviewed that in section number 4, and here is where it is actually executed relative to receiving the cycle count form on a daily basis, if that happens to be your schedule, and then the cycle count program takes effect. Now, moving to page number 2, the next item, J, pertains to the security of the storeroom. And we've mentioned this several times previously in this seminar, and I can't impress upon you the requirement of security. Again, if there is a need to support second and third shift issues or disbursements from the storeroom, there should be a procedure established for that, and only authorized personnel that have been properly trained should enter the storeroom. We also will discuss that a little later in the section, because we do have what we call an off-shift requirement for that particular activity. Item K is either free stock, the bench stock, or the two-bin system. Again, we have 3 different terms for that activity, and this was defined in section number 4 in the inventory management program, but here it is executed by the storeroom. And then item L pertains to the staging area that I alluded to before relative to maintenance work orders, and these would be the planned maintenance work orders. And again, if you feel that there's additional information that you want to add to pages 1 and 2, please feel free to do so. Remember, we're trying to provide you with what we feel is the accurate detail required to get you started. And once you're starting the storeroom program as we have in other seminars, then feel free to add data, change the procedures and the systems as they are required. Now, moving on to page number 3, we're trying to define the objectives of the maintenance storeroom. And the objective is very easy to define. It is the depository of spare parts, tooling, and equipment relative to supporting the maintenance work order, planning, and scheduling system through the use of modern inventory control techniques to achieve the maximum service to the maintenance organization. Now, that maximum service, if you remember, was tied in with the planning and scheduling system for planned maintenance work orders, and the spare parts for those items is the responsibility of purchasing to make certain that the vendor's due date for the material is going to support that scheduled required date for the planned maintenance work order. The inventory management program, as discussed in section number 4, also addresses the future requirements of unplanned spare parts requirements. And here is where we have integrated, if you recall, the where-use code, the service level associated with that where-use code, and then the safety factor that should be used based upon that predetermined service level to support the specific safety stock requirements for future unplanned requirements. So the objectives, again, of the maintenance storeroom are to support the maintenance work order planning and scheduling system through the cooperation of the inventory and the purchasing functions. Now, moving on to item number 4, we want to address some of the main activities or functions that you would necessarily find in the storeroom. And some of this may seem like I'm repeating it, but the data, again, on pages 1 and 2, are the data elements that you should consider to set up the storeroom. And in this case, we're going to talk about the specific functions of the storeroom itself. The first activity is receiving. And item number 2 identifies the data elements that you want to consider relative to the receiving activity. Now, we show part number, description, and unit of measure. And again, depending on where the material comes from, you're going to have to also make certain that the purchase order is acknowledged in a system, or the manufacturing order, or a interplant transfer, as I've referenced earlier, or let's say a return against a previously issued maintenance work order. Step 3 is to verify the quality, and this pertains to receiving inspection. Step 4 is to count the material, make certain that the count is accurate as shown either on the packing slip, the manufacturing order, or the interplant transfer. And then we want to store the material, which would be the next step. And these, you can see, are in some chronological sequence. Then once the material is stored, we want to record the bin location, and then the next step would be to disperse that material and update the different records as indicated in step number 9. We're also going to track the tools and equipment disbursements, and those are tracked through the return against the specific maintenance work order that they were issued against. And the last step would be cycle counting. Now, before we move to page number 5, let me give you some advice relative to the 10 items that we've just reviewed. If you would take each one of those items, item by item, and develop your procedures, the disciplines associated with those procedures, and the documents, as we have discussed, you will have yourself a very detailed and comprehensive outline of all of the activities in writing so that they can be used for training requirements within the maintenance storeroom. Now, moving on to page number 5, there are several pages that pertain to this particular first page, page number 5. In fact, they actually go from page 5 to 10, and this is what I refer to as the item master record data for the maintenance storeroom. Now, the reason I call it the item master record data is the 4 major planning and scheduling functions that we discussed in section number 1 of the notebook all use the same basic data. So it really doesn't make sense to have individual records by activity. So our advice, and especially if you're going to move towards CMMS, is to have a comprehensive item master record that the 4 planning and scheduling activities can use. And let's address those 4 planning and scheduling activities so you're not wondering where I'm coming from relative to those 4 individual activities. The first one, if you remember, is the maintenance work order planning and scheduling activity. That's where everything starts relative to the maintenance operation. The second would be the inventory management planning activity. The third is the purchasing planning activity, and the fourth is the storeroom planning activity. So as we go through this data, I want you to visualize how the individuals will use the specific data elements in this item master record. We also have in the item master record what we call some subtopics or subheadings. The first subheading is general information. General information says that all of these 4 planning activities will probably use this information. The first one is the part number. The second one is the description. The third is the unit of measure, and here we're addressing the different units of measure. We talked about the purchase unit of measure. We could have a manufacturing unit of measure for those items that you manufacture. The next one would be the stores and warehouse unit of measure, and again, there could be a conversion between A to C and B to C, and then we have the unit of issue. So those 4 are used by different people, and where there is conversion capability required, you want to make certain that that's an integral part of the item master record capability. The fourth element pertains to the unit cost. And the majority of the companies, and I'm going to say about 80% that I have dealt with, use what is called a standard cost system. And they use the same cost for 1 year unless there were some major cost changes, and that generally is either precipitated by finance or it could be precipitated by the supplier through the purchasing system. Another large percent, maybe 15 to 20%, use what is called the average cost system, and then some of the other companies use some of the actual or the estimated. Others like FIFO, first in, first out, LIFO, last in, first out, and I've seen a couple of what I call homegrown cost systems. I don't care what cost system you have as long as the cost data that you're using is consistent. Then item number 5 is how do we obtain the particular spare part. Do we purchase it? Do we manufacture it? And in a few cases, some of my clients have actually had the capability of not only purchasing the item, but likewise manufacturing it, especially if a vendor's lead time started to get pushed out because that vendor's, let's say, backlog increased and they didn't have the capacity to manufacture parts to meet a specific due date. So that's merely identifying how we actually obtain the particular spare part. Continuing on now on page number 6, you notice that the next subheading is called inventory information. Now this is used basically by the inventory management group, but purchasing gets involved with this, and likewise planning and scheduling. They use some of the data, and also the storeroom. So item 6 pertains to the inventory class code. And if you remember from section 4, we addressed 18 different inventory class codes. Here I'm only showing 3. The emergency item would be class 1. Spare parts list items would be those that are purchased when a new piece of equipment or a new asset is purchased, which would be class 2. And then standard item, that would be class 3, and all other classifications. Item 7 pertains to the where-use code. And again, this is extremely important from the standpoint to support future unplanned requirements. Next we have the lead time. And here you'll notice we have 2 different lead times. The lead time of purchase, now that's not the vendor lead time, that's what we call the aggregate lead time that we made reference to in section 4 in inventory management. And if you manufacture the part, then you would have the manufactured lead time from operations. Item 9 pertains to the inventory control technique, and that is a 2-digit numeric number. If you remember, that is a byproduct of our inventory ordering matrix that we reviewed in detail, which likewise was in section 4. We have the inventory control technique in terms of who established it and the date it was established, which are referenced in steps number 10 and 11. Now, continuing on to page number 7, we have additional inventory data such as 12, which pertains to the ABC coding, and again that's used for cost reduction purposes and likewise to establish the cycle count program. Item 13, the cycle count frequency code, is the actual date code that is generated by the cycle count program. And if you remember, A items are counted 4 times a year, so those 4 times a year would each have a date code associated with it, and likewise the B items are counted twice a year and the C items once a year. Step 14 is the purchase order cost, and that was reviewed in detail in section 4. The next item 15 is the manufacturing setup cost. If an item is purchased, we use the purchase order cost if we are going to calculate an EOQ. If we manufacture the part, we would use the setup cost. If we likewise are going to calculate an EOQ for manufactured items. 16 pertains to the inventory carrying cost, and again, that is provided to you by finance. And the last item on page 7 again pertains to the shelf life code. Now, moving on to page number 8, you'll notice we have another subheading called storage information. Now, this is used by 2 of the planning groups. It's used, number 1, by the storeroom, but it is also used by purchasing to support through the vendor's packaging process in terms of supporting the way material is actually going to be stored. So one of the key considerations is to determine, if you will, the maximum quantity of a part number that is going to be stored. There is a formula for the maximum quantity stored, and it's very simple. If you would please jot this down, I'm going to go over it with you. The formula goes as follows. The maximum quantity stored is equal to 1/2 of the previous order quantity plus the total order quantity which was currently issued. And if you add that together, you would get the maximum quantity stored, and that quantity, that maximum quantity, can be used for the medium to the larger size companies to help in the layout of the storeroom in terms of the number of bins or the type of storage facility that is required to support the part number and its associated maximum quantity to be stored. Item 19 pertains to the storage bin size code, and that is specifically what I alluded to a moment ago in item number 18, and that is the storage bin number. So for every conceivable type of storage bin that we use within a storeroom, we're going to have a specific code tied in with that, and that code goes into the item master record for that particular item. So we have a consistent way of storing material within the storeroom. Item 20 pertains to the number of storage bins required from the calculation on item 18 above. And then 21 are special storage requirements. These are established by OSHA, by EPA, and other governmental agencies, and maybe by your own, let's say, insurance underwriter. I have only listed a few here, and as you see at the bottom of this exhibit, item H indicates others as required. So let's just kind of walk through these, and maybe we can determine collectively how we're going to store these items. Flammability would require, let's say, a flame-proof protected environment. Combustibility would likewise follow the same type of storage capability. So would explosiveness. Other items like E and deterioration would require maybe atmospherically controlled chambers. And other things that are fragile, as indicated by F, which could be glazing material or other types of containers that are glass made, would also require special storage and handling. And then we'd have toxicity and any other element that is associated for the unique storage characteristics for the storeroom. Now, what 21 is trying to force us to do is in the item master record, in that field to identify the method of storage, again, is to have our storage codes recorded in the item master record and have the procedures and the systems associated with how the material is to be received, how it is going to be stored, and how it is actually going to be issued to, let's say, maintenance work orders. So here again, it's a discipline, but it's providing us with the consistent method of storage. Now, moving on to page number 9, we have, again, some additional storage information, and number 22 pertains to the item characteristics, and really that is the input into the development, if you will, of maximum quantity stored, which we discussed on a previous exhibit. So some of the things that you may want to have in the item master record for physical characteristics would be the size and dimensions, the weight, the bulkiness of the item, and any other application or data element, if you will, that would help us to develop how we're going to store that material. And item number 23 is a pilferage code, and we discussed this earlier, and these are items that should be housed in what I call a bonded storeroom within the major storeroom itself. And continuing on now to page number 10, the next subheading is activity information. And again, this data can be used by all 4 of the planning and scheduling activities. 24 represents annual usage. 25 is the number of annual disbursements. And 26 is the number of annual receipts. And with 25 and 26 data elements, this would help the people in the storeroom to determine where material should be placed within the storeroom, let's say by commodity code, which would be the first field of the part number. And then we would have number 27 is the annual cycle counts and the cycle count errors that we may have found. And generally you may start, when you start off with cycle counting, you're going to detect some errors. And if you remember, we said to set up cycle counting in section number 4, you want to take a physical inventory first, so that item number 27 here should be very minimal in terms of cycle count errors. And then 28 is the maintenance, if you will, of the record that is going to keep track of the inventory adjustments that are made not only in the storeroom, but also on the inventory management record. Now, there's a note at the bottom of the page which indicates that other information as required. And again, here's something that you could add to the item master record. As I said previously, this is an opportunity to put together all of the data elements that the 4 individual planning and scheduling functions would require. Now, moving to page number 11, we want to talk about the storeroom program itself. And what we have done here on page number 11 is to provide you with an outline of some of the considerations in developing the storeroom organization chart, the procedures for the activities, and some of these I know we've discussed before, but we're going to put these into one comprehensive outline, and I encourage you to develop the operating procedures and the disciplines associated with it. And again, if you finish doing that particular task for these items, you'll have the entire storeroom documented relative to all of its activities. The first one is organization, and that pertains to the organization of the storeroom to support the 5 activities that are within the storeroom. And let me address those. Those would be the receiving, they would include the put away, it would include issuing, it would include this consolidation, putting 2 or more locations into one, and it would also include the cycle counting. Now, other activities that really don't affect the record, if you will, but have to be considered in the organization would be the movement of material from the storeroom to, let's say, a job site. So we're going to review the organization, which is on page 12 when we get to that particular page. We must have, if we want to keep track of the inventory investment in stores, by inventory classification and then also by commodity code. And the commodity code, if you remember, is the first 2 digits, the first field of the spare part numbering program. Item 3 is the material identification, which would include the part number, its description, and unit of measure. Now, 4 would be all the procedures and the systems that I mentioned a moment ago relative to ordering. Now, this ordering would be the ordering procedures to support, let's say, the bench stack or two-bin system, to replenishment items that are an integral part of the vendor stocking program, and also issue orders for items that are going to, let's say, go out to a supplier for repair or any other type of ordering procedure. B would pertain to the receiving and receiving inspection activities. C is the storage, and we've just completed, several elements on a previous exhibit relative to storage activities and how you calculate the maximum quantity stored and where it's going to be stored. And see, that's the data that will help to support the procedures and the systems for these items. Item number D is the dispersing procedures and the updating of bin on hand, and likewise updating the inventory record on hand. And then item E pertains to cycle counting. Now, step number 5 is a step that requires, let's say, the compilation of all forms and records. And this would be a very interesting exercise to put those into, let's say, a 3-ring binder, and everyone in the storeroom should have his or her own 3-ring binder. This is an excellent input into a training program pertaining to all of the forms, the different records that pertain to the storeroom, and it will also support not only the capability of enhancing maybe what you currently have, but as new personnel enter the storeroom, they get a copy of that 3-ring binder, and it is the training aid for that individual. Likewise, the management reports, as indicated in item 6, should also go into that 3-ring binder. There are a myriad of different reports that can come out of the storeroom. As an example, the results of cycle counting would be one. The turnover analysis and the investment of both inventory class codes and commodity codes, and other applications like activity information that we discussed in a previous section, in section number 6 here. And any other type of management reports relative to organization and staffing. These are tailored to the management requirements, but I've just tried to list a few to help you to get started in terms of developing the types of forms, the records, and the management reports which I've addressed in item 5 and 6. Every storeroom should have a layout, and the layout should be sort of an overview, if you will, of the storeroom, looking down at it. And the layout should merely reflect the first field of the part number, which is the commodity code or the family code. And that is going to help people, let's say, on off shift, like the second and third shift, to know where they find parts within the commodity. Now, if you have an item master record that is available at all times by part number and bin location and quantity, then that would be more appropriate than looking at a layout. But the layout is important from the standpoint of helping people to address where do certain items go, even through the receiving activity. Item 8 is the security issue, and we've discussed that many, many times. And we'll probably discuss it again. That, to me, is the critical element of inventory and storeroom record accuracy. There's the need to look at the safety requirements within the storeroom. I have just a couple issues relative to safety. One issue would be no material should ever be put on the floor, especially in aisles. Number two, no material should protrude beyond the lip of the shelf for, let's say, a bin system or a skid rack system. In other words, we don't want to have a hazardous working condition. Another safety issue is to have aisles that are properly well lit and other applications. This may be a good point where the safety committee in your company could help establish some of the safety procedures and policies relative to the storeroom. Another key item, item 10, is the type of equipment that is required in the storeroom. And here I'm talking about material handling equipment and equipment that is used for transporting material in addition to counting equipment, scales, and anything else that is a basic requirement to give us the highest degree of data integrity within the storeroom. And the next item, 11, pertains to the training. There's always a need to have a continual training program within the storeroom. And the last application, item number 12, pertains to the data processing requirements. And here we're not only talking about the software requirements, but the hardware requirements. How many terminals do I need? Where should they be located? How many printers should I need? And likewise, where they should be located, and should we consider barcoding, and what type of barcode input and output requirements are likewise going to be required. So I think you can see that page number 11 addresses many key issues relative to the organization of the storeroom, but likewise the systems and the procedures for all of the items listed on page number 11. Now, as I indicated a moment ago, page number 12 is a organization chart, not by people, but by function. And again, the top box in the center indicates someone is going to be the supervisor of the storeroom, and moving from left to right and the various functional activities. We have receiving and receiving inspection. You know, who's going to do that? So we could start to plug in the names, determine the training required, the date of training, and make certain that the individual that you train signs off that he or she thoroughly understands how to support that activity and others as we will review them. We also have the stocking and the record keeping, which is the bin location system. Here we have the order filling, and next we have the inventory control support of cycle counting. So who is going to do the cycle counting? And last but not least, we have the material handling, which is the material movement that I addressed earlier in terms of moving material to the job site. So again, these are not organizational people requirements. In a small company, there may be one or two people in the storeroom that are going to do all of these activities. In medium to larger size companies, there will be several people that will be doing these activities. But the key is not only to define the activity, but the proper training and the proper implementation of those training activities after the training process has been completed. Now, the next two pages, 13 and 14, addresses in a little greater detail the receiving steps. And I've broken down receiving into three individual steps. One is the receipt of the material to determine, is it ours? Check for any damage on containers. Note any damage on the bill of lading. Have the carrier sign the bill indicating damage, and likewise, if there is a requirement, take a picture using some Instamatic camera. That picture, along with the bill of lading signed by the carrier, is going to prevent a lot of unnecessary delay by either the purchasing or the financial department in trying to rectify the cause of damage and other associated activities like who's going to pay for it and so forth. Now, the second step is to count the material. If we have 2 or more containers, a receiving report should go into each container. This is part of the discipline of the storage which is required, because all the containers may not go into the same bin location. So every container would have an indication of who actually counted the material, the date it was counted, and what the count is per container. And then turning to the next page, 14, the third step is the quality assurance or receive and inspection activity. Now here again, you may have separate documents that you may use for receive and inspection. A lot of companies will use the receiving report and have the receiving inspection activity noted on the receiving report that we discussed in step number 2 on previous page 13. This way you have a complete comprehensive audit trail of all of the activities relative to the receiving activity. Now, moving forward on page number 15, we're addressing the requirements for those of you that are moving toward a self-contained storeroom where we're likewise going to ship out of that storeroom. So some of the data elements on page 15 would be the shipping order number. That could be a purchase order number. It could be a return goods number. It could be a shipping order for interplant shipments or any other type of nomenclature which is required to track shipments. We also need the part number, the description, and the unit of measure. And then likewise, we need the quantity shipped, the date shipped, the method of shipment, which would pertain to, let's say, the transportation method. And then we would also have to prepare all of the shipping documents. And on those documents, we would indicate the number of containers, the gross weight, and who actually performed the packing and the filling application if there was more than one person involved, and who finally put the entire shipping package together. I make reference to the shipping clerk number, and then distributing the different shipping documents. And then last but not least, we would follow up with the supplier, or we could follow up with purchasing. So here's an indication of where the storeroom can assist the purchasing activity when they're properly trained, especially to follow up on items that are going to go out for, let's say, repair. The easiest way to set up this shipping program is to have somebody from your current shipping department support the implementation of the storeroom shipping function, including the training that's required and all of the documentation relative to that shipping activity. Now we're going to look at the cycle counting process in the storeroom, which starts on page 16. Cycle counting in the storeroom starts off on page 16, and it also is included in pages 17 and 18. Before we get into the data on the cycle counting program in the storeroom, starting off with item 1 on page 16, let me address what we are trying to accomplish with this cycle counting application as compared to what we actually reviewed in Section 4 when we discussed the cycle counting program as a byproduct of the ABC analysis. In Section 4, we actually developed the systems and procedures to establish the cycle counting program. So as a byproduct of those procedures and the systems, we are now in the storeroom portion going to develop the requirements to execute the cycle counting program. So starting off with item number 1, we want to establish the cycle count interval. Now the interval that we alluded to and used in Section 4 was the frequency of counting the A, B, and C items as approved by the certified public accounting profession. So again, the A items, you should count those 4 times a minimum. That's over a year. The B items twice a year, and the C items once a year. Now when we go to step number 2, we're talking about the interval code. And as I said previously, that's the actual calendar date that the cycle count for that part number would appear on the cycle count form. We also have to establish the acceptable inventory variances. And if you remember from Section 4, on the A items, you must be within 99.5% accuracy. That is the count to the bin on hand record. For the B items, you must be 99.0% accuracy. And on the C items, you must be within 95.0% accuracy. Now, item number 4 pertains to the cutoff procedures relative to the activities of receiving material, filling orders, and actually moving that material out of the storeroom. A cutoff procedure is going to be very key relative to supporting the cycle count program. Our advice to you is as follows. Have the cycle count form prepared 1 but no more than 2 days in advance. Any items that appear on that cycle count form should also reflect whether there are going to be requirements against that part number within the next 1 or 2 days, and those requirements would be basically planned. Remember, we do not know when we're going to have an unplanned requirement. Secondly, we should determine if there are any open orders, such as a purchase order or a manufacturing order or any other order that would require material to be issued within the next 1 or 2 days. If you follow the development of that material associated with the cycle count form, then you should not have what I call the cycle count cutoff problems. So item number 4 is addressing now in a little more detail the little steps that I've gone through, such as the orders to be filled, orders that have been filled but not released out of the storeroom, orders that are filled, issued where the inventory record has not been updated. Remember, when we disperse material, there's 2 records we're going to update. That's the storeroom record and the inventory record. Material received and not stored, and then material received, stored, but the inventory record has not been updated. So if you get those data elements of what am I going to issue out in the next day or 2, what am I going to receive in the next day or 2, and have those issues addressed and have the records updated, then you want to institute the cycle count transaction. Step 5 determines who's going to count, and everybody in the storeroom should be trained to perform cycle counting. The train, and retrain means that the cycle count is taking the place of a physical inventory. It's a very serious financial step, and we want to make certain that everyone in the storeroom thoroughly understands not how to take the physical inventory every day through cycle counting, but the training is the comprehensive training to address the entire cycle counting program. And then continuing on page number 17, we have the ability to cycle count or to count over and above the cycle count a day itself. So let's at least address a few of those. Item 6A is the cycle count frequency code itself. That's the date code. B, if let's say an inventory record goes to 0, you may want to have a copy of that part number where the record bin on hand is go to 0 and take a look. You don't need a scale or anything, but take a look to determine if there's any inventory bin on hand. You may be surprised. When a new order is required, that means I've reached a order point or I reached a minimum, and it would be nice to make certain that that minimum or the order point quantity is accurate. Item D pertains to where you can't locate a material when you're going to cycle count. Well, that means that maybe 2 items have been switched in terms of documentation, and one of the key benefits of setting up the stockroom by commodity code or family code is the ease of trying to find the material based upon its description, because you know by description where those commodities or families are housed. Item number E pertains to a material, when a material shortage is recognized. Go to the bin and determine is the bin on hand actual. Now items 6B through E are just another way to support cycle counting. They do not replace the cycle counting program. They support it. Now we have the report, the physical count that's recorded on the cycle count form. We review that and update that against the inventory record. If there are errors outside of those that are allowable that we have indicated, then we want to reject the count and recount, and maybe the second time around we may have found we made an error in cycle counting, or the original cycle count is accurate and therefore there would have to be an adjustment on the inventory record. Then that cycle count form, as indicated in section number 4, is going to be forwarded to the financial department, and they in turn would update their cycle count financial documents. Now, the cycle count form is identified on page 18. If you remember, I reviewed this identical form with you in section 4, page 17F. So I'm not going to go over the data again, but it's an indication that this document must be in the storeroom program to actually execute cycle counting. Now, moving on to pages 19 and 20, we're going to address some of the key considerations relative to layout. And page 19 is addressing those major commodities or families of items that we may want to consider in our storeroom. Now remember, these commodities are going to be actually physically housed in a particular area within the storeroom, and this is the input, if you will, to a good storeroom layout. Starting off with 1, we would have all of the spare parts by commodity. And again, the commodity is the first field of the part number. Secondly, we need a staging area for planned maintenance work orders. We also, in item 3, would need a vendor stocking program area. Item 4 would be those items that are part of the bench, stack, or 2-bin system. 5 are the extra security items. Those would go into our bonded crib. Item 6 is consigned vendor items in. Item 7 is engineering project items, where the storeroom would be housing those on a temporary basis in conjunction with the facilities engineering group. Item 8 would pertain to contractor project items. And 9 would be unique, special machinery items. They're not part of the commodity code, but they are items that would be comparable to, let's say, the inventory class code 01, not part of PM, major minor overhaul, but we have to have that on hand as an insurance in case that item is required based upon a replacement. We also have item 10, where items are going to be stored that are an integral part of the lubrication program. Item 11 pertains to the janitorial items. 12 are the tools required for maintenance work orders. 13, the equipment required for maintenance work orders. Then we would have on 14 the special environmental items that we reviewed earlier in our item master record. And 15 would be inspection tools and gauges that would be required to support the maintenance work order system. 16, would be the safety items, and those safety items could be used by both maintenance as well as operation personnel. Then there may be a need to have the inventory class 1 items independent of those special unique items, which we identified in item number 9. They could be combined. The shipping supply items in number 18, the shelf life items, which pertains to item number 19, then any obsolete material that has been defined as obsolete but pending a disposition, which would be item number 20, and then we would have an area required for material handling equipment, which is 21, counting equipment, which is 22, and then our packaging equipment, which would be 23, and others as required. I think you'll see that on page 19, we're providing you with a very detailed outline of every major commodity that may be housed in the maintenance storeroom. And this hopefully will help you in your layout or maybe your relayout of the maintenance storeroom. Now moving to page number 20, we're looking at the various layout considerations in terms of the physical layout itself. So we're going to take much of the data that we've reviewed in page 19, and now we're going to indicate how and where and what are the requirements relative to the layout itself. So again, starting at the top with item 1, we would have the storage area. Now this would include square foot as well as cubic displacement. Then 2 would be the storage facilities, which are the different racks, the shelves, the bins, the cabinets, the cantilevers, the carousels, and any other physical storage requirement. 3rd would be the aisle considerations. And 4th is the receiving area. 5th is receiving inspection, and they could probably be combined. 6th would be the shipping area. The 7th would be the issue counter, and several of my larger clients may have 2 or more issue counters as an integral part of their storeroom layout. We have the security devices, that is to get in and out of a storeroom, the counting equipment and its location, material handling equipment, what type, where is that going to be housed within the storeroom, the fire protection equipment. And then item number 12 are the various data processing requirements, such as the platform or a terminal, or computer, excuse me, if that's going to be retained in the storeroom, or the terminals and the various printers, and then last, the various barcode applications. The next item, 13, pertains to the packaging equipment, and then there would be a need for some office space. Likewise, if we want to have a self-contained storeroom, we may want to consider the employee locker area, the lunchroom area, and the sanitation facilities. And then item number 18 and on is other requirements. So I urge you to take page 19 and 20 and look at those and use this as your checkoff list to help you in the support of either a new layout for the storeroom or to reorganize the current storeroom using all of this documentation and data. Now, the last exhibit in this section pertains to a part number program for maintenance stores. Now, we do have an independent one-day seminar on how to develop and maintain a maintenance store's part numbering system. I'm merely going to address some of the key data elements for your consideration. Item number 1 is the development of the part number program itself. In other words, who's going to be part of it? That's the organization, which is 1A, the training that is required, and also the forms and documents that are required for the development and implementation and maintenance of the part numbering program. The second step is the development of the part number data. And our approach has been to define the part number, format, and criteria. And what that means is the format is the size of the part number, and all part numbers do not have to have the same size. And the criteria is the definition of the individual fields within a part number. The same would hold true for the part number description, and that is its format and criteria. A part number program must consider the part number and the description. And then in step number 3, we want to implement the part number program. First thing we would do is develop the cross-reference between the old to the new, and then the new to the old. And then item number 3B says eliminate the old as soon as practical. And 3C is use the new part numbering system and keep it up to date with the assistance of the new item notice program that we discussed in section number 2 of the notebook. And then step 4 is maintaining the new part notice program through the engineering change notice system. As I said a moment ago, the new part notice system. And 4C is the obsolescence program. Now, before we move into the next section, which is craft capacity planning, I think you could see there is a definite need of cross-training of purchasing personnel to know how they work and support the maintenance work order planning and scheduling system, the inventory management program, and the stores program. So what we've covered up to this point is the inventory management program and the stores program. Now we're going to address the craft capacity planning and the development of the maintenance work order planning and scheduling system, and that will be followed by the maintenance work order reporting system. So without further ado, let's move into section number 7, which is craft capacity planning. Now, starting off on page 1 in section 7, we're addressing the capacity planning data requirements. And here again, the reason that capacity planning is in the purchasing seminar and the data is in your notebook is to show you the importance between the integration of maintenance work order planning and scheduling, and the two planning and scheduling activities, if you remember from section 1 of the notebook, is labor, and that's what we're discussing here, and number 2 is the spare parts requirements. So this gives us an opportunity, at least those of us that are supporting the purchasing activity, to understand the planning process that is required in the labor portion, as well as the planning process which is required in the spare part requirement program. So the first thing we address is item A, the craft name. And that would be an electrician, a mechanic. It would also indicate whether the mechanic or the electrician or other crafts, they are journeymen, apprentices. They could also encompass, as an example, machine operators if we're moving toward predictive maintenance, or we're going to move toward total productive maintenance. And in some cases, it could also refer to the support of outside contractors. Item D would be the craft code number, and that is a numeric 2-digit number, and we have an exhibit we'll take a look at which addresses the name by code number. And then item number C would be the manning requirements. We would have groups, which is identified by 1. 2 would be individuals, and the groups, incidentally, does not mean that I would have, let's say, 2 or more electricians or 2 or more mechanics and so forth. That could also include 1 mechanic and 1 electrician working together on a particular maintenance work order. Item D pertains to the shop calendar. Now, in this case, we have a fixed shop calendar. And generally, the shop calendar, from a planning standpoint, could go out 1 to 2 years in advance. And then as we start to move those dates closer, going from planning to scheduling, we can use smaller time elements or time buckets. And in this case, we're looking at a weekly time element, and we could also take that week and break it down into days, and also take the day and break it down into shifts, because a lot of companies that are of a non-processing environment do not have the same complement of craft labor on all 3 shifts. Therefore, if we're looking at the support, let's say, of a CMMS program, we want to make certain that that program will support shift capacity planning, summarized by day and then summarized by week. And that's what we're trying to address here in item D. These are the data requirements for craft capacity planning. Then items E, F, and G actually pertain to the development of the formula, which we're going to look at in a moment, for craft capacity planning. E is the gross available capacity, which addresses the time that that individual is actually on the payroll, not on the job, but on the payroll. F are capacity constraints, and those are known. As an example, rest periods, startup, and cleanup periods. And in some cases where we're operating in a 3-shift environment, it could also include, let's say, a 20 or a 30-minute paid lunch period. And then item F2 pertains to the use of an efficiency or inefficiency factor by individual craft person. And I'll address that in a moment because this could be a very sensitive issue to many companies. G is the net planned available capacity. Now, the way E, F, and G are combined, we would have the gross capacity minus the capacity constraints, and that difference multiplied by the efficiency factor would provide the net planned capacity. And if you need any other additional information, then add item H and so forth. Now, moving to page number 2, we are looking at the coding for the various maintenance crafts and the craft code. Now, here again, I must caution you, this does not include the difference between a journeyman and an apprentice. It doesn't address the group issue. It does not address the contractor or the machine operator issue. So you have to take page number 2 and develop your own craft coding scheme to meet your specific environment. Now, moving on to page number 3, here is where we have our formula for craft capacity planning. The formula, as indicated, reads net planned available capacity is equal to the gross planned available capacity, that's payroll, minus the capacity constraints, and that difference is multiplied by the efficiency or inefficiency factor. Now, the data elements are defined on the bottom portion of page 3. Let me address the efficiency or inefficiency factor. I said this could be a rather sensitive issue, and it really should be reviewed between maintenance management, operations management, let's say the human resource department, and even top management, chief executive officer. The efficiency factor is by employee that I indicated earlier. If the efficiency factor is equal to 100% and in numeric terms 1.00 or higher, then that means the employee is performing the task, let's say on a planned PM program, under the time that was actually estimated on the work order itself. If the efficiency factor is less than 100%, like 0.99 and less, then that means that we're using more time than was actually planned. And I have seen some efficiencies go up to 120%, which would be beautiful if we could do that day in and day out. But on the other hand, I have seen some inefficiency factors go down to 60 and 70%. We don't want to start any type of a furor within the maintenance organization. If you feel that we want to eliminate the efficiency factor or the inefficiency factor, then plug in the efficiency factor as a 100% for all employees to get started. As you start to gain history and you develop a good database of history for each and every employee, you at some later date may want to start utilizing that. Remember, the efficiency or inefficiency factor is a byproduct of the actual time on a job as compared to the estimated time on a job. The question that has to be addressed is the estimated time accurate? And see, that could even give us a wrong efficiency or inefficiency factor. So again, it's something that you have to consider. If I thought we were going to have problems in my organization, and I'm putting myself in your shoes, I would do what Frank advised, start off with 100%. Everybody starts off at the same base. Now, moving on to page number 4, I've addressed here for you some of the more common capacity constraints. 1 is the startup time, 2 is the rest periods, 3 is the lunch periods, 4 would be cleanup. Now, if there's any training programs that have been defined for craft personnel, you're going to have to remove that portion of the time from the payroll portion for that either day or shift, or it could be for a longer period of time. It depends upon the training time element. And then item number 6 would be any other non-maintenance related times. Maybe a craft person may be used in operations, or it may be that craft person may be used in other departments which are non-maintenance related. That's what item number 6 is addressing. Now on page number 5 and 6, we have some examples. They're very easy to follow relative to calculating craft capacity planning. Starting off on page 5, we have a craft code of 02, which is the mechanics. We have 3 mechanics in our shop. We are working 8 hours per day, so the gross planned capacity would be 8 hours. Remember, that's our payroll time. We have 2 10-minute rest periods, and we're going to take that data and put it into the formula. So we have the gross planned capacity is 3 mechanics times 8 hours a day, which gives us a summarized gross of the 3 people, which is 24 hours. We also have 2 10-minute rest periods. So again, 3 people by the 20 minutes, which is the sum of the 2 10-minute rest periods, is 1 hour of capacity constraint. And then step number 3, we put the data into our formula, and we have a 23-hour net available planned capacity program for these 3 mechanics. Now you notice in this case, I did not use an efficiency or an inefficiency factor. Now moving on to page number 6, we have 1 electrician working 8 hours a day. We have 2 15-minute rest periods per day, which would be per shift. And in this case, through history, I know that this person is operating at 85% efficiency. One of the things that I didn't mention before, but I want to bring it up now, because this would be the appropriate time, never use the term inefficiency factor. And you notice the way I've identified this here as an efficiency factor, even though it's below 100%. That kind of takes the sting out of one being efficient and one being inefficient. Now, if we take the data elements and go through the calculations, our gross planned is 1 person times 8 hours, and again, that's payroll. So we would have gross planned available capacity of 8 hours. We would have 2 15-minute rest periods, which gives us 30 minutes. And now we could take that data and put it into our formula. So the net planned available capacity, as shown in item number 3, is the 8 hours minus the 30 minutes, and we're converting that into 1/2 hour. And that gives us 7.5 hours of net available, except we recognize we have an efficiency factor of 85% or 0.85 when we're using that percentage figure in a computation. And in this case, we have a total net available capacity of 6 hours and 23 minutes. And you could see from the previous exhibit, the net available capacity is assuming that those 3 mechanics are working at 100% efficiency. Here, we're being more realistic in terms of this electrician. So rather than having roughly 7.5 hours of capacity per day, we're down to 6 hours and 23 minutes. So those are two illustrations, and you know, you could go through your own computations. You're going to use the same formula. What you have to do is to define your payroll time, define your capacity constraints, be realistic with those time elements, and then determine whether you're going to utilize an efficiency factor. Now, on the next page, number 7 and 8, what I've done here is to provide you with what I call a bar or a Gantt chart. Gantt is G-A-N-T-T, and I've taken one craft day, one shift, and we're going to go from gross to net, and I have all of the data elements defined on page number 7. The shaded areas going from left to right would indicate that S is startup time, and the legend is at the bottom of this exhibit. Then we have AC, which is available capacity. R1 is the first rest period, and then we go to another available capacity. L is a lunch period. In this case, that's not part of the 8 hours of payroll, because working one or maybe two shifts, lunches are not generally paid. Then we would move into the next AC area to the right of the lunch period, which is available capacity. R2 is the second rest period. We'd have additional available capacity, and then we would have C, which is cleanup time. Now, you'll notice that I've identified the time elements for each one of the half shifts, and also the time elements for the full shift. And if you would now turn to page number 8, we now are showing you merely the available capacity for one craft person, and in this case that individual would have a net available capacity of 7 hours and 15 minutes. Now, from a planning and scheduling standpoint, what the planner, scheduler should do is to superimpose upon these time elements the work order time element or work orders time elements to try and fill the 7 hours and 15 minutes to the planner, scheduler's capability. In a lot of cases, you're not going to be able to match 7 hours and 15 minutes of capacity with 7 hours and 15 minutes of, let's say, actual work time. And this is the requirement now of the planner scheduler. Once the available capacity has been defined, and I now can start to load, which is part of the planning process, load work orders to that capacity plan, and then ultimately schedule the work order to a specific craft person by badge number and name, and then we would release the order to the craft person, and then that person would go on his or her merry way to perform that particular activity. And those steps we're going to review in section number 8, which is the next section.